Welcome in to AWA Unleashed. We are the preeminent American Wrestling Association podcast. I am Chris Tubbs. We are talking everything AWA. This week, we are talking about rivalries. What makes a good rivalry and highlighting some of the best in the history of the promotion. That being said, let's bring in the two guys that you guys really want to hear from. That is George Schire and Mick Karch. And guys, before we get into it, I know we've got a special treat. Do we want to tell people about what we've got coming up next week, or do we want to wait till the end?
I would tell them. I think
we should let the cat out of the bag.
Okay. Well, you guys are going to be jumping at anticipation.
See what he did there?
See,
I heard that.
You'll be flying high once I tell you. You won't believe it is a killer guest.
He's worked on this all week, George. You know,
actually, he hasn't talked to us all week. He's been busy coming up with 6 lines.
Oh, well. Anyway, the one and only Jim Brunzell.
Yes.
Jim Brunzell going to be on the program next week. You guys are going to want to tune into that. It is going to be super, super fun and a mighty high killer time. Okay, now I'm done.
Well, we taped the show already, and it is good.
Oh, it's great. Great show.
Jimmy gave a main event performance.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to have a championship time with that show. It's going to be good.
All right, your turn, Mick. Give us as many puns as you can.
No, I'm not going to do that because you basically bored people to death already. So I'll just, let her slide.
You just can't come up with anything. So
that
was the real reason.
I'm removing Mick from the screen. Mick, you've been removed from the stream now. Okay. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and we're going to see if we can do this without him. No, just kidding. All right. You've had enough computer issues. We're actually, oh, by the way, for those that, here was Mick earlier today when he was working on his computer. I kid you not, that's the closed caption for Mick Karch right there. That is his closed caption. But all kidding aside, guys, we've got a great one. We're talking about rivalries, but before we do that, I know we've got a trivia question and an answer you have to give here, Mick.
Absolutely. Last week's trivia question, we wanted to know who was the wrestler that had to ride out of the arena on a mule after the Crusher beat him in a Missouri-style match. And my buddy Dan Salemi from the Chicago area knew that it was Larry Rocky Hamilton, who had a great feud with the Crusher back in the early 1960s. And he came in, they built him out of St. Joseph, Missouri, I believe. And to my knowledge, until his dying day, Rocky and that mule had a wonderful relationship.
Well, having lived in Missouri, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
I think the mule got paid more than Rocky that night.
The rest was
so. Congratulations to Dan.
So it was. Well, I mean, it's
we had some good guesses.
Relationship built out of love, I guess.
Yes. Oh yeah.
All right. So let's get into this week's, guys, and it's about rivalries. And I know there are a ton of them that we could have gone into, but I want to ask you guys, first of all, when we talk about rivalries, George, I want to ask you, what makes a good rivalry in professional wrestling?
Well, any promoter is going to look at 2 wrestlers or 2 tag teams, and they're going to look and see the chemistry between them, what they can do. Will they be able to work together? Can they draw fans together? And a lot of times, on air or in the ring, the promoters will have the 2 wrestlers or the 2 tag teams utterly hate each other and have a reason for their rivalry, whether they've broken a trophy or they've stolen someone's wife or whatever the storylines they can come up with. But the bottom line is
steal somebody's mule, perhaps,
or the tag. Yeah, that too. Or the tag teams have to be able to go together for a long period of time, and the program needs to run over a period of time.
So are there some, I know that we're going to get into some of them. Are they better when they're over a longer period of time instead of something that is, quote, hot shot? Or are those the ones that really have a tendency to pay off when you've got the slower burns? Because it seems like to me, some of the feuds that we talk about, guys, have, it's a long build. It's a slow burn, so to speak. What say you, Mick?
It's a story.
It's a story, and I think it depends on who the guys are in the program. I mean, sometimes it's better to extend it over a long period of time, especially back in the day, back in the glory days. They would build that storyline, boom, 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 for months, and then they would have the blow-off match, the cage match, or the lumberjack match, or what have you. In the modern era of professional wrestling, it's a storyline could be for one night, like you said, Chris, to hotshot the angle, and boom, there it's over with. It really depended, and of course, if the match or the feud wasn't drawing, they put the wire cutters to it. It was over. But for the most part in the AWA, if they had a long running feud, it was very successful.
And one of the things about these feuds is, you heard us say probably in one of our other episodes, that the promoters would sit down and they'd decide where they wanted to be with this program between two guys or two tag teams 6 or 8 months down the road, so they could eventually have the blow-off match. So they have to continually, each match, tell a little bit more of the story and give the fans, as Vern Gagne used to say, we get them to the arena, we have to do something to get them back. And that's the way they would do it. So they were always planning the blow-off match, the cage or the lumberjack match or whatever it was.
That being said, and I always find it fascinating when you talk about booking backwards, what is the blow-off match, the one that ends the feud, and then you kind of go backwards. I mean, my mind just doesn't work like that. So I find that like really fascinating, really interesting. There are so many that we could highlight, but I know that you guys each came up with a list of 6 and a couple of honorable mentions. So why don't we go ahead and, you guys just tell everybody what your top feuds or top rivalries were, and we'll go ahead and see if we can give them some visuals with it as well. George, why don't you go ahead and start it?
I'm going to start mine with it. It started even a little bit before the AWA was formed, and it was between Vern Gagne and Stan Crusher Kowalski. And Vern and Crusher Kowalski had this ongoing rivalry, and you talk about it being real, it was real outside the ring. Part of the problem was, and this is a conception I've always had, Vern had the idea that he could be the only Minnesota wrestler that was of importance. And so if there were other Minnesota wrestlers, he was going to make sure that they were always secondary to him. And of course, he put himself into a battle with him, in this case, Stan. And Stan was never going to win. But their matches, starting in the late 50s, 59, and then moving into 60, 61, and 62, always drew well. They came across as though they really didn't like each other, and it was real. And Stan always gave a good performance, and you believed him when he said he didn't like Vern Gagne. So you saw a program there, Vern versus Stan, and then there were some others over the years. There's Gagne versus Kowalski. Very, very important. But Vern also knew that at times he needed Stan. And so he'd go to him in the instance where when he started the AWA, he had Stan with Tiny Mills, and they were an outstanding tag team, and they became his first champions. But Stan and Crusher Kowalski, always bitter rivals to the very end.
Were there a lot of feuds, guys? And I guess I was going to ask this earlier, but you mentioned it right there. Were there rivalries and feuds that were booked because of guys legit not getting along outside of wrestling, outside of the ring? And then it's like, hey, well, if we can take this real life animosity, if you guys can work together, we can make some money. Were there a lot of them that were born out of that you guys know of? George, I guess I'll let you go ahead and start with that, and then go to Mick.
I think there were, but you have to remember, Chris, that the wrestlers themselves were professional in the sense that if they knew they could make money together, they could bury the hatchet, per se, get in the ring, do their thing. When they're done, go their separate ways. They don't talk to each other. But if they made money together, I mean, they're wise enough to know that, hey, this makes sense.
I agree with that. And it's interesting, too. It's kind of been a storyline over the years where a wrestler will come out and cut a promo and he'll say, I'm not going to fight you here in the studio. I'm not going to fight you out in the back alley. I'm going to do this in the ring at the auditorium where we can make some money and I get paid for beating you up or whatever it was. So, I think there's some truth to it, although you don't hear a lot of situations in the AWA where there was this overall animosity. Vern and Stan Kowalski, like George said, that's a different story. Vern and a couple other guys. But for the most part, like George said, everybody's a professional. Bottom line is get the money.
Was there ever any time where it would start as a work and then you guys found out that it ended up more in a shoot and, a real life, hand-to-hand combat? I'll let you start with this one, Mick.
I can't think of anything offhand that I've heard of that evolved that way, but you could tell it kind of, transmitted itself in the ring. If two guys they're not meshing for whatever reason, if somebody's not selling for the other guy, if there was a blown spot or whatever in the match, then they would get a little bit stiff with each other. So you could kind of tell, hey, this is getting a little bit out of hand. But for the most part, I don't remember too many that went off the path, so to speak.
I would say that if there was one guy that maybe had this happen, Billy Robinson comes to mind.
Sure.
Because Billy, he could go off script if he didn't, and we've talked about this, if he didn't care for what his opponent was doing or not doing, Billy could go off script and shoot on the guy and make it real. And if you had to have a keen eye to see this, but most of the guys afterwards would be pissed off that this happened.
Okay. Just a couple of, I know we kind of sidebarred there, guys, but those were just a couple of questions that I had. All right. George just did his first. Mick, why don't you go ahead and hit one of yours here?
Well, as I mentioned, Vern Gagne, again, is involved in a feud. And this one also was a real life feud. And this is with Larry the Axe Hennig, or Pretty Boy Larry Hennig, as he was when they were feuding. And it was the age-old story. It's been done in wrestling so many times where the trainer or the teacher has the student turn on him eventually. You had a situation where Vern trained Larry Hennig to get into the business. They both went to Robbinsdale High School. Larry started out as the consummate Minnesota babyface, and, he would feud with Mr. M or what have you in the early 1960s. Goes to Japan, where he's called the Viking, actually, in his tour of Japan. And when he came back, there's this change in Larry Hennig. Suddenly, he doesn't want to be subservient to Vern Gagne. He's surpassed Vern in all the technical skills of wrestling. Now they're at each other's throats, and the insults are flying, and the feud it actually started, their first match together, started where Larry attacked Vern as Vern was on his way to the ring, and they took the battle outside onto Grant Street, outside the Minneapolis Auditorium. Now, what's interesting about this feud is, when Larry Hennig calls Vern the pot-bellied, spindly-legged old man or whatever, Larry was shooting in his promos there. When Larry turned babyface, all of a sudden, all was forgotten. The Hennig Gagne feud was forgotten. And then when Kurt Hennig turned on Greg in the late 1980s, all of a sudden, Vern and Larry are at it again at ringside with both of their sons. Vern and Larry are trading punches. Vern in his Argyle sweater, and Larry in his Elk River, sport jacket, and they're going at it. So technically, their feud reignited about 20, 24, 25 years after the fact. And Larry, George will attest to this. Larry did not like Vern. He just did not, and it got to be almost overkill when Larry would give a speech anywhere about anything. He could be talking, about politics. Invariably, it went back to his hatred for Vern Gagne. So there was a real deal and a classic feud.
I did a AWA roundtable at the Cauliflower Alley one year, a few years back, and we had Larry Hennig, Jim Brunzell, and Greg Gagne on the panel. And as I would ask fans to give questions, inevitably they asked Larry about Vern, and Larry went off on the stage. I mean, he was bearing Vern Gagne, and he's sitting next to Greg when he's doing this. And Greg just got the biggest grin on his face, and he put his hand on Larry's shoulder, and he said, "What is it with you and my dad?" And it was funny when you heard him do that because they took the heat off of it. But Larry was legit. He was going off on Vern right in front of Greg.
Oh, man. And I've heard some of the stories that you guys have told that we haven't recorded. And eventually, I think, those might slip out periodically. But it's really a fascinating dynamic between those two. George, what do you got for number 2?
I have one that was really a unique situation. Dr. X had been here for 1 year in the AWA, and Vern Gagne actually gave him the title for a couple of week period to build a rematch, and of course, in a way to reward Doc. But something unique happened on a TV match on the night that Dr. X was to defend his title to Vern in the rematch at the auditorium here in the cities. They brought in a wrestler on TV named Billy Red Lyons. And Lyons defeated Dr. X, the champion on TV, non-title, of course. That night, Vern won back the title, and X was livid because they brought in this ringer that surprised him, and Lyons beat him with his own hold, the figure 4 leg lock on TV. Well, the fun part of this feud is that this, of course, is a ready-made feud they can carry out for the next 3-4 months between Lyons and Dr. X. Little did most people know in those days that Billy Red Lyons and Dr. X, in his real identity of Dick Beyer, were brother-in-laws. And this was something they had done before when the Doc was the Destroyer. And they would feud with one another, and they would team with one another.
Yeah, there's a picture of it right there, too.
There's
on
the Destroyer
screen.
and Billy Red Lyons with a Japanese trophy. They were international champions here. And this feud was a classic because you had the epitome of a good guy. You had the most evil, hated guy on our planet, the guy with the sock on his head, as the Crusher said. And the feud went on for about a year. In any type of combination, tag teams and rematches and stipulation matches. But behind the scenes, real life brother-in-laws who put on a hell of a show for us.
Mick, what do you have for number 2?
Number 2, we've talked about many times, and this is Nick Bockwinkel and Billy Robinson. In their heyday, the two of them, Nick, with or without the title, tag team titles, there was always something involved. But I personally don't think there was a more believable feud. There you see Billy tossing Nick. I believe that match was in Omaha. They had such a believable rivalry, and they were such great professionals that even the guys, because I've talked to some, they'd be watching their matches in the back, and my God, they would just look at each other and, holy shit, that was a stiff shot. Or Billy Robinson, with his European uppercuts or the backbreaker or what have you. They really made you believe when they went at it. And they had, to me, the best matches probably I've ever seen in the AWA. And I've mentioned this before. Nick always said, you're going to get in the ring with Billy Robinson. The best way to do it and the safest way to do it for your own well-being is to go to him in the locker room beforehand and say, Billy, what are we going to do tonight? Billy would tell him, and Nick would say, okay. And that's how it went. That was an easy way to get along with Billy Robinson. Just hellacious matches together.
All right, George, what do you got for number 3?
Well, I have one that probably scans the AWA for about pretty close to 20 years. And again, Vern Gagne. But, Vern was the owner of the company and the promoter and the champion, so it all makes sense to build a lot of these things around him. But this rivalry was a perfect natural. You had to get somebody completely opposite of the all-American pie, mom's apple pie, Vern Gagne, good guy. And who do you get? The dog, Mad Dog Vachon. Mad Dog came in here in 1964. Vern brought him in, and he was an immediate favorite that everyone hated. with his aggressiveness, his clawing, his biting, his snarling, his storyline, eating in garbage cans in Algiers and wanting to come here. And you moved ahead there a little bit, Chris, but that's a picture at the end of the storyline when, lo and behold, Vern got the dog to be his partner because he needed somebody that was as rough as Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson, and no one else fit the bill than the dog, so he asked him to be his partner. And it was a great ending to their feud because can Vern trust the dog? Can the dog trust Vern Gagne? They exchanged the singles title several times. Their matches were always well attended. And when they teamed up, those storylines of the two former enemies coming together and can they live together, coexist together. And then, of course, they won the title, the tag team title. So it was a full circle. But their battles in the Twin Cities and throughout the AWA, best remembered of any.
All right, Mick, what do you got for your next one?
Next one I have is an early 1970s battle. Talk about bloodbaths. This was back in the day when you didn't have to be PG and everybody was doing their own blading and what have you. Every card had something like it. But I'm talking about superstar Billy Graham and Wahoo Mcdaniel. They had one of the hottest feuds, not only in the AWA. There's a shot of superstar Graham, and that was a typical shot of Billy after a match with Wahoo Mcdaniel. Bled all over the place. They started it out with an arm wrestling match on television, and you know how those go. You know, somebody gets hit over the head with a table or, you know, something else. But their feud lasted for a long time, and a lot of people say this was the feud that really made superstar Billy Graham a superstar. Bleeding all over the place. Billy Graham, even in the movie The Wrestler, they kind of played off of it. The original movie The Wrestler, where Wahoo Mcdaniel and superstar Graham are having a bloodbath. They had the famous Indian strap matches all around the horn in the AWA. And I tell you what, they were some pretty brutal matches because if Superstar wasn't holding up his end of the stick, Wahoo made sure that things turned around by the end of the match, whether it was with the strap or the chop or what have you. Great feud.
Was Wahoo, like, he just struck me as the sort of guy that he could get pretty stiff if he needed to.
Absolutely. Wahoo was a very tough guy. I mean, he was a rough wrestler, very professional, you know, to a fault. But Wahoo was one of those guys, you know, you're sitting there at ringside and you're thinking to yourself, man, you know, and I've mentioned before, he absolutely lit up Colonel De Beers, I remember, with some tomahawk chops. And that was par for the course. Wahoo was the real deal.
You know, I'd point out about Wahoo, like what Mick said, you know, that he was tough. Wahoo was. He was one of those guys that didn't have a lot of wrestling training background, came out of football, got into the pro ranks. But most wrestlers, you talk to them and they say Wahoo was tough. He was one of those guys that he was street tough. And that's something that, you know, you can't put wrestling behind. I guess I would rather have a street tough guy behind me than a wrestler any day. And Wahoo was that guy.
Yeah. Hey, before we get to your next one, George, I know that you guys send me these pictures and everything, and I wanted to make sure, because I did put the wrong Gagne Mad Dog picture up there. That's kind of the first one that you were referring to when they were actually, going through their feud back and forth before at the end, like you'd mentioned, when they had tagged up. But I just wanted to let people know kind of that's really what you were talking about, that program right there, right?
Right. Well, that's one of them, Chris. And the thing about the dog and Vern was that Vern, again, being the good guy and so beloved, to have this mangy dog coming in and just, defying every rule. Their matches were great. Absolutely. And he was going to take the title back to Algiers. He was from Algeria back in those days.
Sure.
Who wants to go to Algiers,
Yeah. I mean, once it goes into Algiers, you're never going to get it back, right?
Never.
I mean,
well,
never.
He made Vern wait for 3 years.
Really?
That was the storyline, that Vern couldn't get a chance from 64 to 67. Vern kept the title on him with but a small blink with the Crusher had it. But Mad Dog had it, and Vern wouldn't get a title shot, and that made the storyline. He's dodging me. He's running from me. Mm-hmm. So that's what made it good.
Wow. I had no idea. What do you got for your next one here, George?
Well, I'm going to go with a tag team one here. You know, and again, not being politically correct, in the 60s as well as the 50s, we had Ivan and Carol Kelmakov, the hated garlic-eating Russians. And they were our tag team champions in the AWA in 1962. They won the championship, but they won it from a team that the AWA put one of the most sensational mega pushes on of any tag team they've ever done. And that was Mr. High and Mr. Low, Doug Gilbert and Dick Steinborn, baby faces.
Yeah,
they
and
had a 6-month
there it is right there.
Yep. They had a 6-month winning streak. They won the championship, Mr. High and Mr. Low, but it was a transitional thing. They were meant to win the title and then lose it to the Russians. And their feud went on for another 5 months. And no matches anytime I talk to old school fans, my age, for some reason, they remember Mr. High and Mr. Low, and they talk about those battles with the Kelmakovs. So that promotion, that feud was done right, where they planned in advance in October of 62 to end up in April of 63 with this battle going the duration. And tag team battles like you wouldn't believe. I was only, 12 years old at the time. And of course, I'm cheering at the time for the baby faces. But man, they were rugged matches, and the Russians always cheating.
Yeah, holds true today in the Olympics.
Hello.
Oh, too soon. All right, Mick, I know your next one. You've also got a tag team.
Actually, I didn't have the tag team next, but I can do the tag team next.
Oh, well, no, don't. Well, I fucked that up. Never mind. Well, there goes my transition.
You're the boss. No, the one that I actually was going to talk about.
Well, shit.
It didn't rage for years, but I'm telling you, it was really intense. And that was Stan the Lariat Hanson and Rick Martell. Now, this is mid-1980s. So the AWA is just starting to start that downward descent, just a little bit. And one of the highlights back then, though, was Hanson and Martell. Martell had been here for a while, was tremendously popular. Stan Hanson comes in, maniac, couldn't see a foot in front of him. He's swinging that cowbell and, knocking over announcers and tables and everything else. And their feud basically spent more time outside the ring than probably inside the ring. It was that kind of a feud that they would take all over the arena or stadium or whatever it was. And Hanson was such a bully and such a tough guy. But Martell held his own in these matches, and they were absolutely intense. They weren't these 60-minute Broadways or anything, but I'll tell you what, for the 10, 15, 20 minutes that they were out there, they were legendary feuds in the mid-1980s. And, of course, Stan Hanson takes the championship belt in his series with Martell, and we know how that played out with Stan and the title. So, to me, just a great moment, a shining moment in the mid-1980s for the AWA.
One thing when I look at that picture and I go back and I think about that, because really, I started watching the AWA in the mid-80s, 10, 11. So, that's kind of like the very beginning of it. I remember that you had two guys that just seemed like they were so different. Rick Martell, this good-looking Canadian. Then you had this badass cowboy who would just, like you said, he was just a bully. And it seemed like it was so weird because you had two completely opposite people that were fighting over a title. Like, I could not get my head around how diametrically opposed these two people were.
Well, that's a good point. And I would say that in my estimation, Rick Martell was very underestimated and underappreciated as an AWA champion. Terrific wrestler. I think, if he had any drawback, maybe it was because he had the French Canadian accent, and that's not being anti-PC or anything like that, but his interviews weren't necessarily always stellar. But you bring in a guy like Stan Hanson, with the tobacco, oozing out of his mouth and, just going crazy. It was a perfect dynamic for a great feud, and it did elevate Rick Martell. I think Martell's vastly underrated as a champion.
Chris, I'll add something to that because you just touched on it. The reason these feuds that we're talking about made so much sense, Hanson, Martell, Mad Dog, and Vern, etc., they were direct opposites. And the thing that was clear for any wrestling fan was it was black and white, good guy versus bad guy. They could tell the difference. And maybe that's where the problem is if we wanted to talk about today's wrestling and our world. There's no line anymore. Everything is gray. Mm-hmm. It's hard to tell the good guys from the bad guys, whether it be in wrestling or politics or anything. So in pro wrestling in those days, man, you had Martell versus Hanson or Mad Dog versus Vern, and the fans had no doubt. It was easy.
Well, they were identifiable characters too, and we're kind of getting a little off topic here, but remember, everybody talks about the Attitude Era, the late 90s when everything was just, it was that dose of reality, the breaking kayfabe, with WCW and WWF, WWE now. I think that's really kind of where it started, wasn't it? Where, people wanted that reality and they wanted that gray area. And I think that's why we go back and you look at good guys versus bad guys. Everybody likes that gray. Once we figured out that gray area, that middle part could be where a lot of these wrestlers wanted to be. They wanted to kind of hang out, that we don't have those identifiable characters anymore. And that's what made some of these work so well.
If you think about it, Chris, you're absolutely right in terms of the timing. When Hulk Hogan came into the AWA and he was managed by Johnny Valiant, he came in as a heel, allegedly as a heel, but the fans took to him immediately because, he was a big, strong, tough guy, bleach blonde and what have you. Same thing happened with the Road Warriors. They wanted to bring the Road Warriors in as the nasty heels, and we know how that evolved. So, yeah, the delineation between babyface and heel, that I think you're absolutely right. That's the point where it all started to kind of get, meld together.
But again, back in the old days, when you had two guys or two tag teams that were so different in appearance and in style, the fans didn't have to decide. They could tell immediately.
Right.
And as we evolved, when you look at today's wrestling, and I don't want to go there, but you got 2 6'8" guys, all tattooed, both bald, shaved, and shiny. Who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy? So when you see Mad Dog snarling and growling and, all hairy on one side, and you see Vern, you can't find a hair follicle anywhere on the other side, but he's a good guy. Fans didn't have to decide. And it was a cleaner match.
Shiny.
That's gotta be on a t-shirt.
You like that shiny in the hair follicle?
Yeah, that was good. That was a good one.
Shaved, shiny, and ready.
There it is.
There you're ready.
There's your t-shirt right there. Shaved, shiny, and ready. Oh my God.
Oh.
Somebody get on that merch. All right, Mr. Shaved, shiny, and ready. What do you have for your next one?
Well, this is kind of a tag team. Dr. X had been gone from the AWA scene for 1 year after he lost his mask around the horn, and he disappeared. And it was asked, is he ever coming back? Well, they did a TV angle on the time he was coming back, where Larry Hennig and Lars Anderson were a top tag team at the time. And Lars Anderson comes to the ring with his arm in a sling. Excuse me. He can't wrestle. Doc has a doctor's note. He's going to take Lars's place. Dr. X is going to come in. And there he is. He's being introduced, Dr. X. So Dr. X is a bad guy. But something happened during the match. During the course of the match, Larry Hennig is using the foreign object from his knee, hitting his opponent, knocked him out in one of the falls. And the referee is pointing out to the referee that he's cheating. Larry's getting upset that the doc is, what's wrong with you? And before you know it, Lars Anderson made tremendous recovery from that broken arm. And he was in the ring, and him and Larry were double teaming the Doc. Started a vicious feud. The Doc now has been registered as the hero, being double teamed. And he appeared to be a good guy. Well, lo and behold, they have this long running program. Hennig is getting upset. Lars is getting upset because the Doc is calling them frogs, Hodis and Totus. And he'd walk around the ring going, ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. Seriously. And Hennig would say, the guy's not normal, but they had a good run with it, and the Doc now is a good guy.
What was it? What was he saying there, George? What was he saying there?
Ribbit, ribbit. Hodis and Totus. Where do you come up with those names?
Oh,
isn't it great that as we look back, that all these big tough guys invariably were like 5-year-old kids on a playground calling each other names?
Yeah.
You're a weasel, throwing dog food and cat food and fish food and everything else. That's good stuff.
Vern came out one time and called Larry Hennig Porky. So,
Oh my God! These really are. You're exactly right, Mick. Like, these are like insults that elementary kids would throw at each other on the playground.
But boy, they went over. They absolutely went over with the wrestling fans.
Did anybody ever call anybody a nincompoop?
I don't know that other than George, I don't think that's happened over the years. But they made money. They made money selling rubber frogs and everything else. It was genius, to evolve it into the storyline. But I'm telling you, that was my dad can beat up your dad. Right?
I'm rubber, you're glue. Oh man, let's blow that off with a cage.
Well, and when you have Hennig and Lars, who trusted Dr. X, he was one of their fellow bad guys. And they went to him to be the partner in their time of need. Terrible. And the Doc was double crossing them. Come on. Lars had every reason to forget that he was injured and go in there and take care of him. That was evil.
I'm with you. Yeah, absolutely.
But it made Dr. X very popular.
I know you've got another one with Dr. X coming up in a little bit, George, but what do you got, Mick? I'm going to guess that you've got a tag team coming up here, please, so I can get it right this time.
Bingo.
He's clairvoyant.
You got it.
About damn time I get something right.
And tag team feuds in the AWA over the years have been stellar, so many of them, but I'm gonna talk about one that again is towards the end of the AWA run, and that's Buddy Rose and Doug Summers against the Midnight Rockers. And I'm saying the Midnight Rockers, and I'm also saying Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty. I just want to make that clear.
Oh, I got to mute you for that, Mick. Okay, I got to mute you for that. Okay. All right, go ahead. Okay.
Mid-1980s again, and Buddy Rose and Doug Summers, they're managed by Sherry Martell. And I'm telling you, you talk about bright spots in the waning days of the AWA on both sides. First of all, Rose and Summers were very underrated again. Summers had basically been a job guy and enhancement talent in the AWA. Buddy Rose, of course, Paul Pershman was trained by Vern Gagne, and he was an opening bout mid-card guy when he first got into the business. Putting them together, especially with Sherry Martell, was a stroke of genius. On the other side, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, they're new to the business, basically. They've been in a few years, and this was their first real national exposure as a tag team, and my God, were they over. So not only do you have this incredibly, like, where did this come from feud with these four, but they had phenomenal matches. They had cage matches and no disqualification matches, and they all bled, of course, like stuck pigs. And you look back on some of their matches towards the end of the 1986-87 season, absolutely tremendous and vicious and gory And a lot of fans remember him. So, again, springboard for Michaels and Jannetty on the national scene, and really a nice little chunk of change for Rose and Summers after they'd been in the business for a while.
Yeah, you're talking about this. And again, this goes into what I remember about it. Because I'm fully aware that I did not get a chance to see the AWA in its heyday. So, when you're talking about the demise, I think there are those of us that are like, we didn't know it was the demise. That's the thing. It's like, we didn't know what it was. So we remember those, even though it might not be like, it's like, okay, that was towards the end. I remember that feud and I remember seeing that. And I thought it was absolutely amazing. And I think I don't know if that's just a generational thing where, maybe we look back at it differently, but I look at that and I can remember vividly watching that on TV.
Chris, I think you're right about the generational thing. And fans, George and I are a little bit older than the average wrestling fan. And, we remember a lot of the stuff and we were there. We lived through it. We saw it. So we know what the AWA was all about.
What it was, yes.
Yeah, before
that some of us missed.
Yeah, and you know what? And that's why we're here right now. I mean, this is a good part of the reason that we're sharing this wrestling history with everybody. But if you're in that age group that came in the 1980s when Hulk Hogan started to explode on the wrestling scene, what have you, that's what you remember about the AWA. And sadly, again, this tag team feud was in 1986. By 1991, effectively, the AWA is boom, it's over with. So when I say the decline, they still had some moderately good years yet, but it was definitely turning the corner.
Yeah, it wasn't what it once was with Crusher and Bruiser and Vern and Larry and Mad Dog and Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby. I mean, I totally understand that. And that's why I'm glad that we're definitely doing this project and highlighting a lot of these feuds. Let's go back to yours, George, where you just had one with Dr. X, and you've got another one that to me is really interesting.
This one's really interesting, Chris and Mick, because it's real life taking place and going into a storyline to make a wrestling angle work. And it was great because Ray Stevens was going to have a TV match, and they brought in his opponent, Dr. X, on TV. And of course, what happened is that Ray Stevens ended up beating Dr. X so badly that he broke his leg, came off the top rope onto his leg. You see the doc there in this picture, and he was in such agony that he actually removed his mask right up to above his eyes. That's Billy Robinson attending to him there. But here's where real life fit into this. Shortly after the Hennig and Anderson feud, and Dr. X is now a good guy, he needed to have some very much needed knee surgery. He wasn't working too well with one of his legs, and he needed to have it done. So the idea came up that we'll have a match on television with Ray Stevens and have Ray Stevens break the doc's leg. He does this. He didn't really break his leg, but the doc did go in and have surgery on his knee that was scheduled. He was out of action for a few weeks. But the important part of this is that it built a program between them, because now Stevens is boasting how he put the Dr. X out of action and got rid of him. Doc, on the other hand, is able to say, I'm going to come back and he's going to pay for putting me out of action and I'm losing wages and the whole thing. So the program could run for another 6 months between them in singles and tag matches. And Doc, again, is solidified as the good guy. But that's the way the storyline was. It was real life going into a storyline.
And I'm just going to bring up one more here as we're getting into that one with the return of.
There you go.
Yep.
The story is that he's returning after his knee surgery, his broken leg, and he wants Ray Stevens.
Yeah.
What better can you do? You do this on All-Star Wrestling. Everybody sees it. Doc's leg was broken.
Yeah, I think
great match. Plus, I'd point out that outside the ring, Ray Stevens and Dick Beyer were as close of friends as you could ever find. They started together in the business way back in 54, 53 at Al Half's gym in Ohio. So they were long friends, and they worked out this angle where Doc could have his leg broken.
All right, guys, got about 10 minutes here. I know that you each have, you've got a couple more, Mick. I know you've got one. We got a couple honorable mentions. So what's your next one here, Mick?
My next one, to me, is one of the legendary feuds in the AWA, and it didn't last all that long, but I don't know of anything that was more intense, and that was Bruiser Brody and Jerry Blackwell. And what was amazing about this was that Brody had this reputation, and he came in big, tough guy, and the rebel, no question about that. For years, Jerry Blackwell was one of the most hated villains in the AWA. I mean, he played it to the hilt, whether he was against the Crusher or the High Flyers. Of course, he aligned himself with Sheik Adnan Al-Kaisi and Ken Patera. But they turned Jerry Blackwell babyface at the end of a battle royal in June of 1984, got the biggest babyface pop I've ever heard at an arena for a wrestler. They had built this for a long time, over the weeks that the Sheik's army was starting to evolve a little bit, and Jerry Blackwell seemed to be the odd man out. Jerry wins the battle royal, and Brody and Sheik's army beat the living crap out of him. And after that, they had the series of Brody and Blackwell matches. They were hellacious. A lot of blood, chair shots, stiff as can be. To me, the two, and you talk again about two guys that really were friends outside of the ring, Brody and Blackwell. And when Brody was killed in Puerto Rico, Jerry was just devastated about it. But to me, one of the legendary feuds in the AWA.
All right, let's get to a couple honorable mentions here, guys. George, why don't you go ahead and kick yours off?
Well, this one has to be mentioned as kind of a takeover from last week when we talked about the Crusher and the Bruiser as a team, and they battled the Vachon brothers. In 1965, when the Crusher came back to the AWA and was turned babyface, at that time, Mad Dog Vachon was the AWA champion. So it only became natural that the Crusher was going to get title shots with Mad Dog, and their matches against each other in the 60s, every single one of them ended up with either the Crusher or Mad Dog looking like Mad Dog does in this picture, covered in blood. And they had the blow-off matches, the cage matches. This fed into their tag team feuds at the end of the 60s, and then, of course, the Crusher and Mad Dog again in the early 70s, reliving this feud. It just never burned out. Fans could always come to it.
All right, what do you got for an honorable mention here, Mick?
Jerry Blackwell once again. Only this time it's the legendary Jerry Blackwell feuds with Mad Dog Vachon. Even casual wrestling fans somehow seem to remember the interview, the promo that Mad Dog cut, where Gene Okerlund suddenly, miraculously, finds Mad Dog in his garage building a coffin for Jerry Blackwell, the guy that he called Jerry Fatwell, of course. Now, Mad Dog, of course, is surprised by Gene suddenly showing up. Apparently, the dog didn't see all the TV cameras and lights and microphones hanging in his garage. You must have missed that. He was so intent on.
Forgot about the boom mic. Ignore the boom mic. That's just a bat.
That's exactly right. But Mad Dog Vachon and Jerry Blackwell, legendary again. And Mad Dog, of course, said, the world was not big enough for both he and Jerry Blackwell. So one of them had to go, and it was going to be Jerry Blackwell. And Mad Dog was building his transportation out of this planet in the form of a pine box, a casket. But again, bloody feud, tremendous stuff.
And one more honorable mention for both of you. George, go ahead.
This one here goes back to our buddy Wahoo that we touched on earlier, and the strap matches and the toughness. He had some battles with Larry Heineme and Buddy Wolf. I will point out that for those that heard me talk about Lars Anderson earlier, Well, now he's back in the AWA as Luscious Larry Heenan. And they had some battles with Wahoo Mcdaniel. You see here, they're wearing a Crusher is a loser and Wahoo Mcdaniel is a loser. And they had some tag team matches, but the Wahoo strap matches and the Wahoo battles against these two guys with Crusher and various partners were certainly the very early 70s highlights for all three wrestlers. And the Crusher and Wahoo are losers. You got to love it.
Wow, that might be one of the most hurtful things that I've ever heard somebody called. Is just
it's terrible. I mean, they had no respect for.
You know what was interesting about that, Chris, is that those T-shirts. This is a fact. Mm-hmm. Larry Heenan owned or was a part owner in the Shirt Shack franchise here in the Twin Cities area, and I guess in the 5 states. Where they printed up your T-shirts, so he had easy access to that steam iron or whatever it was. And he printed up some shirts, and I'm sure Vern was very happy about it. AWA didn't have to go out and pay for the shirts.
Well, the interesting thing about the shirts too, and the whole feud, is it started when Wahoo Mcdaniel, God bless him, he comes into the ring with his big headdress on, all the regalia, and Larry Heenan and Buddy Wolf had the audacity to tear up his and break apart his beloved headdress. And of course, what did Wahoo have to do? He had to defend his heritage, and you had an immediate feud. So
I wonder how many of those headdresses Wahoo had torn up over the years in the various territories.
Well, I don't think he had a Shirt Shack that made those.
That's true.
Go to the local headdress shop. Head shop, maybe. Headdress shop, I don't think.
Your last honorable mention here, Mick.
All right, I'm gonna go off the wall a little bit here.
Again,
Bobby Heenan, Bobby Heenan, and Blackjack Lanza. That to me, that's one of my favorite feuds in the AWA. Of course, the Lanza was part of the Heenan family for years and years. With not only Bobby Duncan, but of course going back to his WWA days with Blackjack Mulligan. And they turned Blackjack babyface after an incident in Winnipeg, Canada, I believe, where Bobby decided that Jack was going to be, he was a carbuncle. He was no longer needed. And so Bobby and Blackjack had a short feud where Jack actually got Bobby into the ring. Remember the first time Jack came out as a babyface at the St. Paul Civic Center, he came out in an all white cowboy hat and jacket, and the crowd went absolutely crazy. They had what was the bunkhouse match here in the Twin Cities area, and I think they did it around the Horn. And I'm telling you, there's one hellacious bump that Bobby Heenan took where Jack has a strap wrapped around Bobby's throat, and he starts to Irish whip him into the corner and then pulls back on the strap as Heenan is in midair. And you're looking at this and you think, my God, how did he not break his neck? But very, very enjoyable, engaging, tremendous stuff, especially the back and forth banter between Heenan and Lanza.
One of the things that was unique about that feud too, Mick and Chris, is that it was the storyline of these longtime buddies and partners having this falling out. That's what made wrestling in that era so great. How could Bobby Heenan turn on Jack Lanza? And Mick, said, Lanza came to the ring, white boots, white trunks, white jacket, white hat with a big white feather on it. And he was no longer Blackjack. And I was there, Mick was there. The pop in the St. Paul Civic Center for that entrance was, you didn't expect it. And Heenan went bonkers, but their matches, and that I think was the very first bunkhouse match. It may have been stolen by some rival group later on in wrestling.
We got about 4 minutes left here, guys. Before we get to this week's trivia and the shout out, Mick, I know that you want to pay tribute to a friend of yours that you lost this week.
This is getting to be way too much, Chris. Seems like we're doing this all the time now, but want to mention Mickey Hanson, who refereed as Mickey J. That's Mickey and I back at Cauliflower Alley Club a few years ago. He refereed and actually wrestled a little bit for the WWF, WWE, and also extensively for WCW. He's been battling some issues, health issues, for the last couple of years. I've known Mickey Hanson going way back. He was an old fan club guy, from the Midwest here. And sadly, he succumbed to what they are saying is COVID pneumonia. And, like I say, we're doing this way too often, losing way too many people. But Godspeed, Mickey.
Yeah. All right, let's get to the trivia. I know it's not an easy transition. Let's get to the trivia and then the shout outs. We got about 3 minutes here.
Okay, trivia question this week. And if you know, I will send you some wrestling memorabilia. Larry Hennig held the AWA Tag Team Championship on a few occasions. I want you to tell me who were his tag team partners. So it's more than one guy that held the championship with Larry Hennig. And there you go. If you know the answer, you're going to win some memorabilia.
Right. And again, I'm gonna put that question up on the screen here because I had a different one queued up. But there you go. There it is. Email Mick or George, Mick Karch at Gmail or George Schire, GS Schire at Comcast.net. And this week's shout out, guys, we got about 2 minutes left here. Why don't you go ahead and kick it off here, George?
Hey, I'm going to give a shout out to my buddy, Chuck Miller. And he is the son of the legendary Dr. Bill Miller, Mr. M, here in the AWA. And Chuck Miller, great wrestling fan. And he followed his dad and his uncle Dan Miller so long in the business. And Chuck and I have talked previously on the phone and shared stories about Mr. M. And just a great guy and somebody I think deserves to have a shout out and know that we appreciate what his dad did and that Chuck keeps his memory alive as well. So, Chuck, you're the man.
All right. What say you, Mick?
Hello, and a shout out to Jim Pouquet. And Jim is a local Minneapolitan here, and talk about an old school guy. He remembers everybody from the enhancement talents to the ring announcers to everybody going way, way back. Always such a kick to talk old school wrestling with Jim. Loyal to the cause. Listens to the podcasts every week. He's one of the first guys to send those emails and talk about how much he appreciates us. So we appreciate you too, Jim.
And I'm going to go with my friend Nathan Tim on Twitter. Follows me on Twitter. Follows the show at AWA Unleashed. Nathan, I know you've been through some things, brother, but just let you know that I'm always here. If you need it, my DMs are open. And thanks for supporting the show, and thanks for always chiming in on messages. So there we go. And guys, next week again, Jumpin' Jim Brunzell. You're going to be jumping out of your skin to hear it. There we go. There. That's about the best I can do to promote it.
About me and my mitts.
He waited the whole show to do that one.
I think I just dislocated his shoulder.
I mean, it absolutely is terrific. Jim, he's an honest guy. He's open and honest.
Yep.
Gonna love it.
Yep. And you can catch Jumpin' Jim Brunzell. Then after that, we've got a special topic. We're going to talk about the overly pushed or overly exposed wrestlers, maybe ones that didn't necessarily deserve it, but we got too much of them, whether or not you like it. Till then, enjoy Jumpin' Jim.